Today we're going to talk about converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. So there's a couple different ways that you can convert between these three. But we're going to look at the basics, kind of separated. First looking at converting from a fraction, then decimals, and then last looking at starting with a percent and then converting. So up here we're going to look at converting from a fraction to a decimal. So we are actually going to let you use a calculator for this. So this should be even easier. But the step, all you have to do is divide the numerator by the denominator. So the top number divided by the bottom number. A lot of people get confused and they think, oh, you have to have a bigger number divided by a smaller number, but not when we're working with fractions. So all I'm going to do is plug into my calculator 1 divided by 4. If I do that, I should get the answer of 25 hundredths, 0.25. If we have a fraction and we want to turn it into a percent, we've kind of been practicing in that a lot recently. All we have to do is set up a percent proportion, which we should know how to do. So all you're doing is saying, okay, I've got a fraction, 7 over 12. That equals what percent, because we are solving for the percent, and percent is always out of 100. Now we've got a basic percent proportion that we should be able to solve by looking at the diagonals. So I'm going to multiply the diagonal that has two numbers. 7 times 100 equals 700. We divide by the number that's on the same diagonal as the variable, divide by 25, and you should get 28. We were solving for a percent, so this should be 28%. All right, now let's look if we start with a decimal, how can we convert between the two? So for decimal to fraction, first step is we determine what place value the decimal ends in. So if we look at this decimal right here, we have the tenths, hundredths. It ends in the hundredths place. So once we figure that out, we write the decimal number as a fraction over that place value. So the decimal number, if we ignore that, is 56. And we write it as a fraction over whatever the place value was. So if it's in the hundredths place, it's going to be over 100. Then the last step is we simplify using our factor chart. So I'm going to look at 56 and 100, find their GCF. They both divide by 4. 56 divided by 4 is 14. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So our simplified fraction is 14/25. Okay, let's look at one more example here, because now we have a different looking decimal. We look again, what place value does it end in? This is the tenths place. So that means now I'm going to write it as a fraction, 8. Not over 100 this time, but over 10, because it ends in the tenths place. So this ended in the hundredths over 100. This ended in the tenths, so it's over 10. Same thing, use our factor chart to simplify. Their GCF is 2, so I divide them both by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. So their simplified fraction is 4/5. If we have a decimal and we want to change it to a percent, we do that by moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. So let's look at this example here. We take our decimal, we're going to move it twice to the right. Once, twice. So our new decimal goes here, and we ignore the original one. So this makes it 54, and then we don't really need this decimal here. We could put it there. We're just going to add a percent sign at the end. Okay, let's look at this example. We need to move it twice to the right. We only have one number, so I move it once, twice. We put that new decimal there. Since there's no number there, we are going to fill that in with a 0. So our number, we ignore that first decimal, now is 40. And we add our percent sign, 40%. Okay, again here, we're moving our decimal twice to the right. Once, twice. It doesn't actually go to the end this time. It stops in between the 3 and the 5. So I can ignore this decimal. I can kind of ignore those zeros in the front. and I just have 3.5, 3.5%. All right, now let's look if we start with a percent and are changing to either a fraction or a decimal. So a percent to a fraction. Well, if we think about percents, percent is out of 100. So basically, we are going to set it up as a fraction over 100 every single time because that's what percent is out of. So if we look at this, I take my percentage of 32. I kind of ignore the percent sign, write it as 32 over 100. Then we simplify using our factor chart. If I look to see what they both divide by, they both divide by 4. 32 divided by 4 is 8. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So their simplified fraction is 8 over 25. And then the last, percent to decimal, it's very similar as decimal to percent. We're just doing it in the opposite direction. So first, we are ignoring our percent sign and adding a decimal point to where that goes. And then where it moves in the opposite is we're going to go 2 decimal places this time to the left instead of the right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this as 48, and I'm going to put a decimal point where the percent sign is. Now I'm moving my decimal 2 places to the left, once, twice. So my new decimal is on the left here, which I'm going to put a 0 in front of to write it properly, gives me the decimal of 0.48 or 48 hundredths. Okay, the second example, again, we ignore the percent sign and we're going to put a decimal in its place. So I'm going to write this number as 137 with a decimal right there. I take my decimal point, I move it once, twice to the left, which lands it in between the 1 and the 3. So that gives me 1.37. And this last one. Again, I ignore the percent sign here. I'm going to put a decimal in its place. So this gives me the number 6 point. Now I'm going to move that decimal point twice to the left. Well, I've only got one number. I move it once. If I move it again, my new decimal goes here, and I need to fill in that spot with a 0. So, again, it's proper to write a 0 to the left of a decimal, and then I get 0.06 or 6 hundredths as my answer.